as a mark of a bygone era, when, he quotes, belief in every kind of prodigy was established. So Marshall asserted that, quote, an author would not be faithful to the manners of the time who should omit all mention of them. He is not bound to believe them himself, but he must represent his actors as believing them. Unquote. In other words, don't object to the ghosts and superstitions, people. Get on with it, because that's the representation of the times. So Marshall also praised the original Italian author's lack of bombast, digressions, or unnecessary descriptions. And believe you me, Walpole's ruse did work, because the monthly review, which was one of the review magazines then, was relatively mild in its attack on the Gothic absurdities. It said, if you can digest the Gothic absurdities, it's a work that will entertain you. But surprise, the monthly review praised William Marshall's taste and candor in criticizing the flaws of the original author. The critical review conceded that, in spite of the absurdities, and here I quote from the critical review, the characters in the novel were well marked, and the narrative was kept up with surprising spirit and propriety, unquote. Now, besides these reviews, Walpole was also emboldened by the fact that the novel was a huge hit, so much so that he had to publish a second edition in 1765. In this edition, Walpole acknowledged his authorship, characterized the work as a literary experiment, and admitted that his earlier fraudulence was dictated by his wariness about potentially negative reaction to his work. And he even justified his blend of comic and tragic scenes by alluding to, hello, Shakespeare himself. And this is what Walpole said in the second preface. Let me ask if Shakespeare's tragedy of Hamlet would not lose a considerable share of its spirit and wonderful beauty if the humor of the gravediggers was omitted. He was rather angry there. Unquote. So Walpole declared that though he was, quote, at liberty to lay down the rules of the new species of romance that he was creating, he merely followed the examples of English masters in blending generic conventions. So, while the confession of his literary innovation stemmed from Walpole's assurance of his success, his allusion to Shakespeare was a deliberate move to impart legitimacy and respectability to the work. So therefore, you see, I'm trying to draw a parallel between Walpole's techniques and his villains' techniques of posing themselves, creating a persona of respectability for themselves. But became a bit of a double-edged sword for them. So the next slide, as you can see, is called Horrors of Transgression. In spite of the persuasive power of their respective fraudulent narratives, both Manfred and Walpole's successes were short-lived. Both of them suffered the consequences of transgressions epitomized by their fraudulent fictions. Manfred's ruses were offset by the intervention of supernatural elements, and I have a little picture there. There are funnier pictures than that, but this is the least funny, so I just included that. Recognizing the fact that Friedrich, who's the next of kin and is supposed to inherit the castle, recognizing the fact that Friedrich lusted after his daughter, Matilda, Manfred nearly convinced him of uniting the two houses via a double marriage. Friedrich would marry Matilda and Manfred would marry Friedrich's daughter, Isabella. Wonderful, right? But it gets worse, because Isabella was engaged to Manfred's own son, Conrad, who, by the way, gets killed in the very first scene of the novel by a giant helmet which drops on his head. Great. Wonderful. So my son is dead. I marry my would-be daughter-in-law and I retain my hold over this house. What a wonderful scheme. But see, Manfred justifies it by saying, and this is where the cleverness of the shrewd storyteller comes in. He says, I can divorce my wife Hippolyta because our union was incestuous in the very first place. So what he's doing is that he's constantly varying and manipulating and changing his narrative to suit his own purpose. Very similar to what Walpole actually is also doing with his first and second prefaces. But, so what happens to Manfred? Just when Friedrich is almost convinced of the plan, the servant Bianca bursts into the room with uh, the rather scary account that there is a giant ghostly hand on the staircase. The ensuing terror and chaos momentarily frustrates Manfred's designs. Later on, a skeletal hermit, and you just saw a glimpse of that skeletal hermit in the next slide. Later on, a skeletal hermit reprimands Friedrich for his, quote, carnal desires and commands him to forget Matilda. And of course, Friedrich is scared enough and he says, okay, enough, enough. I'm scared of these ghosts. No more Matilda. Forget him. Okay. So that's Manfred for you. Now we go to Walpole, and this is where I draw a parallel between the punishments that Walpole is suffering for his transgression to the kind of supposed, we might say, harassments that Walpole is suffering because of his literary transgression. So, as punishment for Manfred's transgression, the supernatural horrors that terrorize the castle may be paralleled to the critical acrimony that Walpole suffered, especially after he admitted his authorship. And see, this is the same monthly review which had earlier said, okay, we can digest the Gothic absurdities. It's fine, but there are other merits to the work. Same review explodes, just explodes, and says, while it considered the,
Ma'am.
yes, I am on the last page, Joshi.
Yes, okay, ma'am. Thank
Oh,
you.
okay, hang on. My presentation just went away. Oh God, the witches are really conspiring, aren't they? Is the presentation back? No.
Yes, ma'am, it's back.
Okay, right.
Yeah,
So
we
that's
can
the
see.
last slide, as you can see. The monthly review exploded that while it considered the Castle of Otranto as a translation from an ancient writer, it could readily excuse its preposterous phenomena and consider them as sacrifices to a gross and unenlightened age. But as a modern performance, it deserved no such indulgence, for it exhibited a false taste in a cultivated period of learning. So suddenly, the elegant language, the highly finished characters, and even the candor and taste of the purported translator, William Marshall, that the reviewer had praised, suddenly vanishes. The reviewer even says that I'm appalled because Walpole, an author of refined and polished genius, should be an advocate for re-establishing the barbarous superstition of Gothic devilism. Walpole's established persona as a polished genius added an extra stigma to the work. So beneath the vicious attack of the reviewer, what seems to be implied is that there is a vindictiveness, and that Walpole has committed a literary sin for which he needs to be punished. So the final point is to draw a parallel between the reviewers and the supernatural, and that's my last slide. The supernatural element in the story and the reviewer's attack share two characteristics. They are both arbitrary and vindictive. In Walpole's Gothic story, the supernatural apparently represents providential justice that intervenes to avenge the sin of usurpation and restore the original owner of the castle. Yet, this didactic reading is untenable because Ricardo, who was the original usurper, never faced any punishment because he built a abbey for Saint Nicholas next to the castle, atoned for his sins. It is poor Manfred who suffers, and not just him. Both his children are killed, and his wife has to go through the agony of two dead children. So even if we account for the fact that Manfred is greedy, he is suffering for his ancestors' sins. And in fact, William Marshall debunked this particular moral of the story in the first preface. He said, the moral of the story, the sins of fathers are visited on their children to the third and fourth generation, would not act as a deterrent to tyrants. So don't read the story for this particular moral, read it for other reasons. So therefore, I view the specters in the story as embodiments of Walpole's authorial anxiety about the critical reception of his work in an age that debunked the Gothic as barbaric and vulgar. The critical vitriol hurled at Walpole, especially after he admitted his authorship, lends credence to this reading. Much like the ghosts in the castle, the critics appear vengeful and arbitrary. And just as the spectres can't simply be read as agents of divine justice, the reviewers can't be interpreted simply as objective correctors of false taste. Therefore, Manfred's actual castle and Walpole's literary castle become embodiments of authorial anxieties, housing devious yet charmingly ambivalent artisans of fraudulent fictions. Thank you.
A big thank you to Professor Madhuchanda Rai Chaudhary for taking us brilliantly through Walpole. The last speaker for the night is Professor Monikinkini Boshu, Assistant Professor of English at Sister Nivedita University. She will be speaking on Love and Magic in Harry Potter. Professor Boshu, please.
Am I audible, everyone?
Yes.
Yes, Bobby.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Very good morning to all my
Good.
co-presenters and literary enthusiasts. I am so glad that I am spending the last day of February with such a erudite crowd, and I'm so happy that you have actually stayed up till this wee hour. And now we're going to do the last paper, and I'm going to be very precise about it. And let me just give you a kind of feedback into the paper itself. This is a work in progress, primarily because I am so emotionally attached to Harry Potter that I might just go haywire. So if I go haywire, excuse me because I'm the youngest speaker. I know you all have that ability to excuse. So on that note, we begin. So the title is You Are Protected by Your Ability to Love and Magic in Harry Potter. J.K. Rowling had perhaps formed the narration of her most famous series of books from the perspective of an adult waiting for a magic to happen. This was somehow reflected in the first book of the series that presents to the readers a different kind of communication with the protagonist who lived under the stairs of his aunt's house. Potter was a misfit in the house, an outsider who was never welcome. This presents the reader with a longing to see the boy being loved. The unintended magic that he performs out of his extreme emotional excess at the zoo makes us wonder if the magic he has within can be kept in control. This obviously is when we do not know the details of the series. The first time reader is completely lost in the series of events and becomes attuned to the happenings around the protagonist. In the year 1997, the first book found itself amidst the readers and was an instant bestseller. The elements of horror, bloodshed, and treachery seem to be lost on the concept of the serene idea of love that lingers in the background of Harry's survival. Harry's life becomes an instance of a very powerful ancient magic. The protection on him is because of his sacrifice, of the sacrifice of his mother, Lily Potter, who has made this kind of a sacrifice possible in the book and is stated by, not in the book, and it is stated by Professor Dumbledore, the headmaster of the Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The relationship between the absent parents and the present Potter is problematized as the plot progresses. Magic obviously remains one of the major motivations that enthrall the audience to look at the perspective of Dumbledore and believe in the words that he speaks about the protection. So, when I tried looking at the history of the statement, I found it enchanting that mostly talked about the book was its element of fantasy and Gothic tropes. What is not being talked about, perhaps, is the mysterious love that makes a 7-year-old boy's touch too much to bear that Rowling presents. She presents him as a person who perhaps lacks self-confidence. The greatest dark wizard of all times, as he is described by Rowling, one needs to have courage. So Quirrell fails to resist the touch of Potter, and Dumbledore points the magic involved to be love. We have the narrative talk in the book to make Harry able to devise different levels of success utilizing this element of love. In the Half-Blood Prince, he is given the Felix Felicis, which is popularly called in the book as liquid luck, slughorn, and asked to use it well. But the potion again is Slughorn himself, the history of Tom Riddle's turning into